What's up everyone, Raf here from BNC Camera, and in today's video we'll be sharing some of the best camera setting options for video. Cameras have advanced dramatically from their inception, even within the last 10 years. Modern mirrorless cameras and DSLRs now include an abundance of options, which you may play with to alter the appearance and feel of your film. The keyword there is play. Filming should have a bit of fun behind it, shouldn't it? With so many cameras to pick from, many individuals get nervous and opt out of the simple approach of using their cameras in auto mode. But there's a better way to do things for improved results. Skip the auto mode and manually tune the equipment settings. Is it worth all the trouble to change each camera settings manually? The answer is pretty obvious, of course it is. And the good news is that it isn't challenging to do so. Although digital cameras appear to have an endless number of settings, there are only 7 that you should pay attention to produce high quality video. Those 7 are video resolution, frame rate, video bitrate, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and white balance. And of course we're going to be detailing each of these in the video today, so that way you'll know how to get that high quality video footage every time you pick up your camera. Hopefully you have a pen and paper handy. Without further ado, let's jump right in. First up, of course, we have video resolution. Video quality is determined by the number of pixels in the video, referred to as resolution. The better the resolution and picture clarity, the higher the pixel count. We suggest that your video resolution be set to 1920 by 1080 pixels or higher. In theory, you should use even 4K or even higher settings, but not all cameras support this. 4K is close to becoming consumer grade, but not quite yet. Some of the biggest channels on the web upload videos in 1080p resolution, so don't worry if you don't have access to 4K. At this point, it's more data for editing, but it isn't how everyone is experiencing your footage. Always starting with the highest resolution possible is a good rule of thumb. If you need to reduce the resolution later, you may do so in video editing. Inversely, it isn't possible to achieve a higher resolution after the shoot, so keep that in mind. The only thing to consider when shooting at high resolution, which might deter you from doing so, is the amount of space on your memory cards and whether or not you have a computer that's beefy enough to handle all that pro footage. If you're still in the process of upgrading your cards and computer, 1080p is still the industry standard, so don't use 4K as an excuse not to shoot. Next up, we have frame rate. The frame rate of your camera, also known as frames per second or FPS, should be adjusted. The FPS determines the motion blur or the movement in your video. The camera option is simple since the standard is 30 frames per second for the NTSC area, which is commonly known as the American regions. This frame rate works fine in most situations, especially if you're uploading to YouTube. However, if you want more realistic film appearance, consider lowering the frame rate to 24 frames per second. This is generally considered cinematic, as this is the frame rate we've been watching movies for over 100 years. To touch up on higher frame rates, shooting around 60 or 120 frames per second is mostly reserved for slow-mo. Lowering your video settings anywhere below 24 frames per second starts to look like a stop motion animation, so keep the rule of 24 frames per second in mind. Consider this. If you shoot at 120 frames per second and you divide that by 30, which of course is a reference to the standard frames for the NTSC, you'll basically get around 4 times the slow motion. Same rules apply for 60. Just take it within divisibles of 30 and you'll get your slow-mo speed. Math and stuff. Fun, right? Moving right along, let's go ahead and talk about video bitrate. Now it's time to manually change your camera's video bitrate, which determines the quality of the recorded video in each frame, once you've decided the desired frame that is. The bitrate is the number of megabits per second, or Mbps, used to create each video frame and is represented as bits, ones and zeros. A bigger file implies a greater bitrate, which means you'll deal with a larger file. This sounds great in theory, but again, keep an eye on the size and the speed of your memory cards. Bigger files require larger storage demands. Setting the bitrate is problematic because it depends on your camera. Because every device has access to various bitrates, this is a question of personal preference. Another thing to remember is that bitrates aren't comparable across the board. For example, 18 megabits per second may be the maximum setting on one camera, but the lowest option on another. Generally speaking, the bigger the number of bits, the better because this translates to less compression on your resolution. For example, 1080p footage processed at a higher bitrate will look way better than 4K footage processed at only 5 megabytes per second. Now we've touched on this subject numerous times before, but let's discuss how your exposure triangle will affect your overall video image quality. First up on the triangle is shutter speed. You figured out the resolution, frame rate, and bitrate, so it's time to look at the settings that will affect the appearance and feel of your detail shot. The setting of your shutter speed will have a significant impact on how the motion of the video appears to the audience. The shutter speed, which refers to the time it takes for light to reach the sensor, is also a setting many photographers seem to overlook. It's also essential since it helps determine the exposure and brightness of the photograph. So needless to say, it's a vital parameter to understand. You'll be able to reduce the chance of any motion blur by quickening your shutter speed. On the opposite end of that coin, you'll be able to accentuate motion blur with a slower shutter speed creatively. But be careful, images are usually better when seen in crisp detail. Here's the important part. The frame rate option you've chosen determines the optimum shutter speed for your film. The general guideline is to use a shutter speed double that of the frame rate. So for example, a frame rate of 30 frames per second necessitates a shutter speed of 60 seconds or 1/60th of a second on your camera. Set the shutter speed to 1/48th of a second if you've gone with a cinematic look by setting the frame rate to 24 frames per second. However, not all cameras have this option. 1/50th of a second is close enough and will still produce excellent outcomes. Next up, let's discuss aperture. The opening in the camera lens is referred to as its aperture, and is adjusted to increase or decrease the quantity of light in a photograph. Consider it like a person's eye. The more wide open your iris is, the more light you're allowing into your eyes. The aperture is the lens opening size, which controls how much light enters either a photo or a video sensor. The smaller the aperture, or wider the lens opening, the more light enters into a shot. Reducing it, on the other hand, or narrowing it, produces a darker image. The aperture is more than just a way to adjust brightness though. The aperture may modify the entire appearance of the picture while at the same time blurring out the background and keeping the subject sharp and in focus. This is known as depth of field, or the zone of focus within your shot. Just remember, the blurrier backgrounds tend to add emphasis to your subject. While highly desired in portrait photography, use a shallow depth of field sparingly in the video because you don't want this technique to lose its potency throughout a 5, 10 to 45 minute video. And last but certainly not least in terms of the exposure triangle, we have ISO. The brightness of your shot is determined by the combination of your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. The term exposure triangle is often used to describe these three settings because they all impact how a video or photo appears in terms of brightness. ISO is usually the following setting to consider once you've set the shutter speed to match the frame rate and adjusted the aperture to get the desired look for your photo or video. ISO is a variable that may be used to increase or decrease the brightness of your shot electronically. It's a great and easy tool, but be cautious as the higher the ISO, the more noise depreciates the image quality. Noise refers to the graininess that you see within your photos. This is also applicable to the video side of the house as well too. ISO efficiency and range vary from camera to camera, so do the research and add external light sources when the situation deems it so. With the exposure triangle out of the way, let's hit on the final piece of the video puzzle with white balance. Another option to consider is white balance, which can significantly impact the shot's appearance and feel. Depending on the light temperature you find yourself in, the footage might appear blue or make the subject appear like an orange Oompa Loompa if you incorrectly set the white balance. Cameras generally come with pre-programmed white balance settings that are set to shoot in the sunshine, on a cloudy day, or under artificial lighting. Another choice is to manually adjust the color temperature number, which is commonly referred to as the Kelvin number. We've already done a video on the Kelvin scale, so be sure to check that one out if you want the full details on that specific topic. But basically, the lower on the Kelvin scale, the warmer the light. The higher the number, the cooler or bluer the light. Whew, and that's all 7 for you. Keep those settings in mind. And if you have absolutely no clue as to where to start, just start with anything and fine-tune each of those settings to what you or your client needs. We've covered a lot of ground today, so feel free to hop back to whatever segment block you need in this video. If you happen to have any questions, let's get the conversation started in the comments section down below, and either we or any of our awesome viewers can help find the answers you're looking for. Hope you found this one informative and enlightening. If so, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like so we can push out more facts to help you in your shooting game. Thanks for listening right to the very end. Raph here from BNC Camera, and we'll catch you on the next one.